A grenadier from the 3D platoon heard a noise in the brush to his front. He fired a rifle grenade. The 60mm mortars fired a mission for the 2D platoon, their muzzle blasts lighting up the back of the farmhouse with an orange flame as they coughed out their projectiles. A few rounds of enemy artillery fell in the draw to our right. We tested our phones. The night settled down to an ominous silence. It seemed that I had been asleep only a few minutes when I awoke. The pillbox was a mass of men moving about with apparently no pattern. A deep, dull throbbing filled my head, accentuated by a fierce pounding that pushed relentlessly against my temples. I jumped from the bunk with a start. The throbbing in my head was a big gun firing. The man seated there by the table was covered with a dull brown dust. Blood was streaming from a gash on his forehead. "A tank's firing right at us, Captain," Sparky said excitedly. "They hit the shed with the mortarmen in it. Sergeant Patterson got a cut on the head." I tried to shake the cobwebs of sleep from my brain. I had been asleep for hours. It was daylight. It was 8 o'clock in the morning. I moved over to the wounded man. He was Sergeant Lee Patterson, a North Carolinian and one of the squad leaders from the mortar section. The wound was bleeding profusely. Another man held a handkerchief immediately below it to prevent the blood from running into the sergeant's eyes. "It's not bad," the sergeant said. "Just a cut from some loose brick. It was flying all around the cellar when the shells hit. Looks worse than it really is, I guess." One of the men from the CP group yelled to us from the entrance, "They've hit the house! They've hit the G house! It's burning like all hell!" For one awful moment, realization of what it would mean if the farmhouse burned swept over me. There was no other place for all those men inside to go, those that escaped. They could never crowd into this one pillbox, and now the entire hill would be completely exposed. I pushed my way through the crowd of men and reached the entrance. The heat of the flames struck me as I reached the outside. Another soldier ran across from the rear shed to the pillbox. The tank fired again, and a shell swished close overhead. I realized with relief that the roaring mass of flame was not the farmhouse, but the big shed that had served as our latrine in the rear. It was half full of straw that evidently quickly fed the hungry flame. The smaller shed, whose basement had housed 2 squads of my mortar section, was a shambles of broken timbers. Just past the shed, the abandoned tank destroyer was being greedily consumed by flame. The tank, or SP gun, was firing from the left flank, from the same vicinity as the machine gunner who had harassed us the preceding day. The armour-piercing shells whirred inches above the top of the pillbox. The flames from the shed leapt higher and higher, fanned by a steady breeze from the rear that pushed them closer and closer to the farmhouse. The men inside the house must have been watching it even more anxiously than I. I felt relieved when I heard the crackle of the farmhouse roof and realized that it was a slate roof and would not burn. "How'd it start?" I asked of no one in particular. Sergeant Tom Castro of San Antonio, Texas, one of the mortar squad leaders, answered, "We were all asleep in the cellar of the shed. I guess it was the first shell that hit square through the door above us. It ricocheted down into the cellar and bounced around the walls, knocking bricks everywhere. The second one hit right after. Then they hit the TD. We took off over here." I noticed that all the men from the mortar squads were covered with brown dust from the shattered brick. "I don't see how that 4G shell missed getting one of us," another man said. "There were 10 of us in that one little cellar." The enemy gun continued to fire. I went back into the pillbox and called the artillery observer in the farmhouse to ask if he could spot the enemy weapon, but he had been unable to pick it up. Lieutenant John B. Fudikar of Pendleton Orr, the anti-tank platoon leader, spoke over the phone before I put it down. He had a man who was hit pretty badly and wanted to bring him over to my CP. They might hit the house. The Kraut gun had already knocked out one of his 57mm anti-tank guns. I called for litter bearers from the aid station to come to the L Company CP, and Lieutenant Fudikar and 3 men brought the casualty over on a makeshift stretcher made from 2 rifles and a blanket. The aid man from the L Company platoon across the trail gave him a shot of morphine. "He was out taking a crap when the shooting started," someone said. "Hell of a thing to shoot a man with his britches down." The soldier had a deep gash in his stomach from a piece of shrapnel. The aide man dressed Sergeant Patterson's wound. 2 men got the litter we had used to remove the bodies from our area, and they started back towards L Company's CP with the casualty. Sergeant Patterson could walk. The tank stopped firing, and the excitement was over almost as quickly as it had begun. The mortar men made running trips to the cellar of the wrecked shed and brought their dusty equipment to the CP. There seemed to be no other spot for emplacing the mortars. The 2 sheds had provided the only concealment the weapons had enjoyed. I called the L Company commander, Captain Walter J. Eisler of Butler, PA, and explained the situation. He said he thought he could double up his men in the pillboxes to our rear and give us the use of the emplacement 75 yards from my CP. That seemed to be the only solution. Scotty made a hurried reconnaissance and returned in a matter of minutes. He could put 2 of the mortars in the entrance of the rear pillbox, but that left 1 weapon still exposed behind the farmhouse. But Sergeant Castro's squad was soon digging away at the sloping forward side of the entrance to our CP. We were to have a 60 mm mortar embedded in our front door. Captain Anderson telephoned that the fighter planes should be over shortly and that we should display our identification panels in front of our forward foxholes. We were excited at the prospect of seeing the fighters in action and chattered like excited schoolchildren. But we had no sooner displayed the bright orange and rose panels than we were ordered to pull them in. The planes would not be over until shortly after noon, and they had decided not to use panels. I reluctantly ordered the platoons to pull them in. The sun came out. I was seated at the table inside the pillbox when the first drone of the fighter planes reached my ears. Battalion had warned us against rubbernecking, and I, in turn, had cautioned the platoons. But not a man would miss seeing the demonstration for any amount of pillbox safety. My company headquarters and Sergeant Castro's mortar squad formed an impromptu cheering section at the mouth of the pillbox. 5 sleek P-47s, their wings shimmering in the sunlight, droned high above us in the blue and crossed our position. 3 of the planes seemed to stand guard above the German-held ridge to our front, while the other 2 peeled off into graceful dives down, down, down toward the German pillboxes. There was not a shot fired at them. Every German in the area must have been hugging the bottom of his hole for dear life. The 2 planes seemed to be on reconnaissance. They did not fire their cannon nor drop their bombs, but climbed gracefully back into the sky for a rendezvous with their companions. Then they appeared to decide that now was the time. Each plane circled high into the air and came down with the skill and grace of a pirouetting dancer upon its target, the bullets from its cannon beating a staccato chant of death as it dived on the Germans below. Someone behind me said, "Oh, them goddamned beautiful birds." We watched in silent admiration as the planes climbed once again. They appeared to be working individually now upon previously assigned targets. 3 of the P-47s dived again, their cannon fire beating a path on the ground before them. The other 2 came in on their targets in gliding dives. Someone cried, "Look!" and we saw 2 single bombs dropping toward their targets. One crushing explosion followed the other. A 3rd plane headed in on a bomb run. Its missile found its mark, the pillbox which had housed the machine gunner who had harassed us the preceding day. Slabs of concrete cascaded into the air. We cheered. "That was one of the targets we gave 'em," I said, proud somehow like a school kid who has his theme chosen for reading to the class. 3 of the planes climbed high into the sky and soared off to the rear. The others made a final strafing run and droned off into the distance to join their companions. Our cheering section began to break up as the men filed back into the pillbox. The Germans had not fired a single shot at any of the planes. "Well, their work's all done for the day," someone said. "Yeah," a mortarman answered, reaching for a shovel. "They'll go home now and have a short scotch and a hot bath and shack up with some mademoiselle or some limey bitch. What a life!" "Yeah, and draw a double salary for it," a headquarters man put in. "That's the life for me." Willie Hagan said, "Oh, dry up. You never had it so good." The burning of the shed across the trail had destroyed our only latrine. The barn portion of the farmhouse made a satisfactory substitute, but continued shellings and harassing small arms fire made us wary of crossing the open space to the house. As a solution, we began to dig a latrine on the sloping backside of the pillbox entrance. A group of men was working on the latrine when the first big shell came in. The whirring, screaming approach of the shell preceded it, louder than any we had experienced before, as if a boxcar were hurtling through the air. When it hit, there was a resounding explosion that seemed to rock the very foundations of the pillbox. Flying shrapnel sprayed the trees around the farmhouse. Someone said, "My God, what was that?" The men who had been working outside more dived than ran into the pillbox. There was an excited exchange of words as each man gave his opinion of what the Nazis were throwing at us now. This must be the kitchen sink. Silence fell over the group. A faint explosion from far behind the German lines came to our ears. A few seconds later came the whir of the approaching shell, then the explosion. It was close. Little metal concussion taps on the walls of the pillbox reverberated with a metallic tinkle, announcing to us for the first time that they were there. The face of each man bore a querulous expression, asking with his eyes for the explanation from the faces of his neighbours. Someone said the concussion would blow us apart if one of those babies should hit in the entrance. Another agreed. In the distance we heard the sound of the big gun firing again. Someone cautioned quiet. We waited expectantly. There followed the scream of the shell, the explosion, the shrapnel spraying the trees around the farmhouse. "Might as well let battalion in on the fun," I said. "They want shelling reports, so we'll give them one while it's going on." Another shell exploded while I was getting headquarters on the phone. Captain Anderson answered. "They're hitting us with a big baby this time, Andy," I said. Someone stepped to the door to take a compass azimuth on the sound of the gun firing. "I'm getting you an azimuth." "We hear it back here," Captain Anderson said. "Sure sounds big all right. How long does it take to reach you?" I looked at my watch. "Hold on," I said. "Here comes one now." The big gun boomed in the distance. The seconds ticked away. 13 seconds. 14 seconds. The scream of the shell. I ducked unconsciously. 15 seconds. 16 seconds. 17 Boom! That one was right on top of you, wasn't it? Yeah, damned close. 17 seconds. They seemed to be trying for the farmhouse. The soldier returned with the azimuth. 166 degrees, I repeated into the phone. A minute of silence, then again the distant boom of the gun, the elapse of endless seconds, the crash of the shell, the spray of shrapnel. "It's a railroad gun," Willie announced authoritatively. "They had some of those bastards at Brest. They gave us hell till the Air Corps came over and knocked 'em out." I wish to hell the Air Corps would come over now. I take back everything I ever said about the Air Corps. The shelling continued, one round at a time. They exploded to the right of us, to the left of us, to the rear of us, and to the front of us, but never, as we feared, in the entrance of the pillbox. And through it all the target, if indeed the house was the target, stood unscathed. We counted the rounds. We reached number 13 and waited again for the distant report of the gun, but it did not come. The battalion adjutant, Captain James T. Noten of Austin, Texas, telephoned around 6 o'clock. Division had set up a rest camp at Vielsalm, Belgium, and company I must send 14 men and 1 officer for a 48-hour rest. They would leave from battalion headquarters at 8 o'clock in the morning of October 11th. I begged to have the quota reduced since we were so short of men, but the answer was no. Sergeant Ulbin broke down the quota equally among the platoons, allowing 1 man from company headquarters. I designated Lieutenant Brock over his protests as the officer to go. The Germans were nervous again when night came. Burp guns echoed up and down the line in the early part of the evening. They tossed in an artillery barrage around 10 o'clock that fell to the rear of the CP but caused no damage. The 1st and 3D platoons began their exchange of positions at 11 o'clock and were through shortly after 1. The night settled down to its routine noises. An outgoing artillery barrage whistled a goodbye message above the pillbox. Snores from the sleepers filled the room. Sometimes a sleeper would snore so loudly that I thought surely the enemy would hear, and I would awaken him and tell him to turn over. I didn't know what I expected the Germans to do if they heard it. Savage sealed envelopes for me as I signed my name as censoring officer. I wondered how soldiers could write so much mail. One man had written his wife 5 different letters in one day and enclosed them in as many different envelopes. 2 o'clock. I had had only 4 hours of sleep the preceding night, and it began to tell on me now. I could hardly keep my eyes open. 2:30. Stay awake. Stay awake. We'll have to turn in earlier tonight, I said to Savage. I just can't seem to stay awake. Let's call it quits at 3. Savage sleepily mumbled his agreement. I was nodding often as the hands of my watch neared 3 o'clock, awakening each time with a start and shaking my head in an effort to clear the sleep from my brain. A shot rang out. It seemed to come from the very entrance of the pillbox, and was the cue that set off a fusillade of small arms fire that reverberated back and forth among the hills. I could discern the slow chatter of one of our heavy machine guns, then the intermingling of the guttural tone of a burp gun. All the sounds seemed to emanate from the area around the farmhouse, as if every conceivable type of small arms vied to be heard above the accompanying noises. The explosion of a German-type concussion grenade joined the uproar. An American grenade exploded, and its fragments whined through the air. A few rounds of mortar fire exploded above the din. I heard the guards scuffle and curse as they tripped on the entrance to the pillbox. I was suddenly more afraid than I had ever been before. My body seemed weak all over, and I wondered if I had the strength to stand up. I opened my mouth to sound the alarm and wondered if anything would come out. "Wake everybody up!" I shouted, surprised that words actually came forth. "I don't want anybody caught asleep in this damn pillbox." We had waited long enough. The Germans had come. The sound of the small arms fire continued, heightened by the explosions of dozens of light mortar shells. The paroxysm of fear that gripped me left my body trembling. I was not so much afraid of what was happening as I was of the horrible visions my mind had dreamed up of what would happen should we fail to repulse the attack. I visualized the mad dash to reach the entrance to the pillbox to escape entrapment within, only to be met by a hail of enemy fire or the hellish blast of a flamethrower. My imagination ran a gauntlet of evil. So this is a counterattack. Well, this is what you have been waiting for. Now the company of veterans will find out what it has in this youthful, inexperienced CO. Quit shaking, damn it. Stop trembling all over. Get control of yourself. Act like a soldier, goddammit. At least you can impersonate an officer. Savage tried the battalion phone. The handle, which should have produced a ring, made an unnatural grating sound. "The line's out!" he cried. "I'll try the other line. Blackburn, get your radio set up outside." The sound of the battle rose to a crescendo of crackling small arms fire and booming mortars. The explosion of fragmentation hand grenades sent pieces of steel whining into space in all directions. The mortarmen from Sergeant Castro's squad stood poised near the door, waiting for my word to begin dropping shells into the metal tube outside. Men from my headquarters group lay half reclining on their elbows on their bunks, the dazed expression of sleep still on their faces. Sparky tried the phone to the platoons. The line was still in. The first platoon wanted artillery fire to their left front and around the yellow farmhouse that stood between them and the town of Utfeld to their front. The Krauts were hitting their left flank, and they could hear movement and shouting in German in the underbrush to their front. Technical Sergeant Eli Smith of Baltimore, Mundede, the platoon sergeant, was on the phone. Long was outside the pillbox. "I can't get through on the other wire either, Captain," Savage said. "I talked to the artillery observer in the house. His line's dead too." "That leaves the radio," I said, and turned to Sparky. "Tell Scotty to fire his 60s for Goffigan. I don't want Castro to fire his. He's too close." I hurried through the dark winding passageway from the pillbox. Blackburn was adjusting the longer of the 2 antennas for his 300 radio. The cord to which the speaker and receiver were attached enabled him to leave the box of the radio on the outside and pull the telephone-type receiver inside the entrance. Overhead, The tracer bullets from countless weapons etched a fantastic, fleeting pattern against the night sky. The firing seemed to come mainly from the front of L Company's right flank platoon, 75 yards from us in front of the farmhouse, but I could occasionally discern the characteristic sound of our light machine guns firing, and I knew that the first platoon was engaged. The German guns said, "Brrrp." Our machine guns answered, "Put, put, 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 put." The firing stopped abruptly. The mystery-laden silence was for a moment even more terrifying than the noise of the gunfire. Had the Germans broken through? Were they even now rushing towards the entrance to the pillbox? It seemed like minutes that must have been only seconds before another single shot rang out and again set off the blaze of fireworks. The curtain of fire formed itself above us again. Blackburn's efforts to get battalion on the radio rose above the din of the firefight. "Hello, Able 1. Hello, Able 1. The noise of the butterfly switch turning as he waited for an answer, but no answer. "Hello, Able 1. Hello, Able 1. Come in, Able 1. The amplification of the radio lent an eerie quality to his voice, increasing its volume so that I thought it must surely direct the attacking Germans to the very spot. The sudden cough of the 60 mm mortars to my rear told me that Scotty had been ready and waiting the moment we called for fire. The dry, rasping cough of the weapons was like music. Behind me, Sergeant Castro and his squad fretted because I did not let them fire. "I can't get 'em, Captain," Blackburn said, his voice half frantic. "Battalions sitting on their fat asses and haven't thought once of setting up their radio." "Keep trying," I said, my voice shaking. "Maybe they'll get the lead out. We've got to get through." It sounded trite after I had said it. I went back into the pillbox. "What does the first platoon say now?" I asked. It was a stupid question, but it gave me an excuse to go back inside the pillbox, and I thought perhaps getting away from the damp night air at the entrance would lessen the shaking of my body. It didn't. "The mortars are coming in fine," Sparky said, "but he still wants artillery. L Company must not be firing any mortars or artillery." "Maybe their platoon line is out," I said. "I haven't heard anything but our 60s. Tell Scotty to shift left to L Company's front." I checked my map in the light to know the concentration to call for, should we succeed in getting battalion on the radio, and stepped back to the entrance. "Hello, Able 1. Hello, Able 1. Get Andy on. Get Andy on." It was Blackburn. He had gotten through. I waited impatiently while the operator called Captain Anderson to the radio. I wondered if I could control the quiver in my voice when I talked with him. The sound of firing sputtered and died to only a few rifle shots, but then it increased once again to its rapid tempo, enlivened now by the sound of our mortar shells exploding close in to the front of the L Company platoon. "Hello, Able 1. This is Andy. Send your message. Over." I took the receiver from Blackburn. "Hello, Able 1. This is Mac. Attack is hitting my left flank and right flank of Love Company. Their lines must be out too. Fire us concentration 221. Over." I shivered from a combination of the chill and the fear within me, and I knew I had failed to keep my voice from quivering. "Roger! Wait!" The small arms fire stopped almost as suddenly as it had begun. We waited expectantly in the pregnant silence for it to begin, but except for the sounds of the men in the pillbox behind me, all was quiet. A hand grenade exploded, and its fragments whined through the air. One of Scotty's mortars coughed rapidly 3 times. Then silence. "Hello, Able 1. Hello, Able 1. Over." "Hello, Able 1. Over." "Hello, Able 1. 221 on the way. Over." "Hello, Able 1. Roger." "Wait." A second later, I heard the sound of the artillery pieces firing in the rear of us, followed quickly by the whine of 3 outgoing shells. Even before they had exploded to our front, 3 more explosions came from the rear, and 3 more shells whistled overhead to explode in the draw to our front. I heard the last 3 shells of the concentration begin their outward journey. "Maybe we can catch 'em on their way home," Blackburn said. The concentration was perfect. I called for concentration 223, which would place fire to the front of the L Company platoon, and for a repeat on 221 to our front. I told Scotty to hold up on his mortar fire now that we were getting artillery. We would need the ammunition. The threat had passed. We signed off temporarily on the radio, leaving it open until just before dawn, when a wire crew from battalion would repair our telephone lines. I went back into the pillbox. Almost half the men were already sound asleep again. Bit by bit, the story of the German attack materialized. A heavy machine gunner on the right flank of Company L had heard a noise to his front shortly before 3 o'clock. A figure loomed up before him only 5 feet away. For some reason, the gunner had challenged instead of firing. The German fired his rifle in answer to the challenge, wounding the machine gunner in the shoulder and setting off the fireworks of the attack. But the machine gunner had killed the German who had wounded him. The rest of the night was a nightmare of whining grenade fragments as the nervous GIs around the farmhouse tossed hand grenades at anything that moved. A wire repair crew from L Company was almost hit by a grenade from one of the anti-tank men, and my guards feared for their lives as they stood in the open in front of the pillbox. I called Lieutenant Fudikar and asked that he stop his men from promiscuously throwing grenades. The situation improved, but not before they had neatly killed 2 roving hogs. It was 5 o'clock when I finally climbed into my bunk. I wondered what the men of my headquarters group thought of me as a company commander now. Had I been a complete failure? Had I done anything correctly? Was my fear as noticeable as I imagined it must have been? But perhaps they thought of me as one of them now that we had experienced our first action. That was how I wanted it to be. A man from L Company, moving about his foxhole the following morning, found a wounded German soldier a few feet away. The soldier was taken prisoner and evacuated to battalion, where he spoke freely to interrogators. His story was relayed to me, revealing that the prisoner was part of a company of 40 men who had been specially trained for retaking pillboxes and had moved into our area the preceding day. There were 2 such companies in the area. He had understood that tanks equipped with flamethrowers were to have been used in the assault, but he did not know what had happened to change the plans. They had been told that the pillboxes occupied by the Americans would be heavily stocked with K rations and cigarettes, and that all they took would be divided among the men of the company. Their objectives were the farmhouse, the pillbox occupied by my command post, and the 3 pillboxes to the rear of my CP. To reach the vicinity of their objectives, they had guided on the glowing embers left from the early morning fire when the large shed to the rear of the house had burned. He had been only slightly wounded in the arm and could have escaped after the fight, but he wished to be taken prisoner by the Americans. It seemed to him that a large number of his comrades had been killed or wounded in the attack, but he thought they would make another attempt to recapture the pillboxes. An enemy tank that fired on the forward platoons and avoided all efforts to silence it with artillery by moving around to different positions woke me at 9 o'clock. It caused no damage except harassment and finally ceased firing after an hour. Private Zellin, one of the battalion messengers, arrived midway through the afternoon with a stranger whom he introduced as Fred Bankers, a war correspondent with the Associated Press. I expressed surprise that Zellin had brought him over the exposed route in daylight. Except for my reconnaissance on the day we moved into the position, we had avoided going across the crest of the hill, except at night. Mr. Bankers was writing a feature story on life inside the Siegfried Line. He took the names and addresses of most of the company headquarters men and Sergeant Castro's mortar squad and asked questions about the life we were living. "Well, if you're from Boston," he said to Butare, the 2D platoon runner, "I suppose what you'd like best about now is a dish of good old Boston baked beans, right?" "That's right," Butare smiled. "Nothing better." The correspondent turned to Private Croteau. "And how about you?" he asked. Croteau was sullen and seemed to object to the correspondent's questions. "I've got nothing to say," he said morosely. The other men in the pillbox looked up with sudden interest in what was being said. The correspondent seemed to miss the tenseness which his question and the answer had developed. "Oh, come now," he said. "Surely there's something we could say you're missing for the folks back home." "I've got nothing to say," Croteau said with an inflection in his voice. I looked at his eyes. There was a curious flame kindling there that caused his eyes to sparkle in the flickering candlelight of the pillbox. The correspondent started to speak again. "Okay," Croteau interrupted. "I've got something to say. Tell them it's too damned serious over here to be talking about hot dogs and baked beans and things we're missing. Tell them it's hell, and tell them their men getting killed and wounded every minute, and they're miserable and they're suffering. Tell them it's a matter more serious than they'll ever be able to understand. Spread it on thick and leave off the sweet syrup that all the others write about." There was a choking sob in his voice. "Tell 'em it's rough as hell. Tell 'em it's rough. Tell 'em it's rough, serious business. That's all, that's all." A tense silence followed his outburst. I was slightly embarrassed by the happening and attempted to cover up. "Croteau's right," I said. "Try to bring out what a wonderful job these riflemen are doing over here, a little of the hell they're going through, and when they do get home, those of them that do, that there's nothing on this earth the people at home can do for them in return that would be half what they deserve." Zellin left with the correspondent at dusk to return to battalion. A few minutes after their departure, an enemy light artillery barrage centred to the rear of the farmhouse but caused no damage. I figured that the two men had had sufficient time to leave the area before the barrage began. Sergeant Albin spoke to me about Croteau. "I'm sending him into the aid station tonight, if that's all right with the captain," he said. "He's been running a temperature with a cold for 3 days, but he's tried not to say anything about it. And you heard him this afternoon. His nerves are shot. He's been coming to this ever since he got pretty badly shaken up in that pillbox explosion at Brest." Croteau left us that evening. Night, with its nerve-wracking ordeal of darkness, settled down around us again. The supply vehicle arrived, and Sergeant Albin called the platoons to send carrying details for their supplies. The platoons did not want to send carrying details at the moment. The darkness seemed just too quiet right now. Something must be up. It must be only nervousness, I told myself, but I agreed for them to wait. The 1st and 2D platoons would send men as soon as things looked clear. The 3D platoon had everything they needed for the night, and would like to wait until shortly before dawn. Something might happen while their carrying party was gone, and they were so damned short of men. The nervousness of the rifle platoons brought the company's low strength to my attention. Croteau had been the 13th man to be evacuated since our arrival in the pillbox positions. The strength of the company on the night we had moved in was 56 below normal. The 13 evacuations had reduced the total to 123. Only 80 of these were in the actual forward fighting positions, 80 men to defend a 500-yard front with a 200-yard gap on the right flank. Then I remembered that 14 men and 1 officer must leave before dawn the next morning for 48 hours in the division rest camp. 2 of these men would come from the mortar section and company headquarters, leaving only 68 men and 2 officers in the forward foxholes. The thought staggered me. An enemy artillery barrage swished into the area around 10 o'clock and brought the guards scurrying to the protection of the pillbox. I was grateful for the barrage at the moment the shells were falling. It seemed to break the mystery of the silence around us. But when it was over, the atmosphere seemed more tense than before. The 1st and 2D platoons sent their carrying parties for ammunition and supplies at 11 o'clock. The atmosphere was as tense as ever, they said, but they knew they had to send for the supplies eventually. I stepped outside the pillbox to urinate. The night was gripped again in a death-like stillness. The mysteries to the front were cloaked in an all-enveloping veil of dense darkness. Someone near the farmhouse threw a hand grenade. A squeal of terror told me that the local pig population was having difficulty with the anti-tank gun crews again. I went back inside and continued my lonely vigil beside the telephones, stifling yawn after yawn as I tried to write a letter, turning instead to censoring the stack of outgoing mail. The hands of my watch showed that it was approaching 1 o'clock. I stared at the watch with half-seeing eyes and thought of the time pattern of the past German attacks. They had struck the company on our right at 1 o'clock in the morning, 3 days before we relieved the 28th Division Company. Last night's attack against L Company and my left flank was set at 3 o'clock. The time neared the hour, and the love of consistency which history and fable have given the Germans preyed upon my mind. If they attacked tonight, it would most likely be on the hour. I strained my ears in an effort to hear through the pillbox door and into the murky blackness beyond for some sound. I knew not what. My fear and nervousness increased with each passing minute until I thought I would surely scream. The loud jangle of the telephone bell made me jump with a start. Savage was dozing. How do you do it? I would take it. I Company, Captain MacDonald speaking. Just checking your line, sir. It was the operator. The door of the pillbox seemed to me a megaphone in the stillness. I asked the operator if he could not leave our switch open and whistle for us instead of ringing. Yes, sir. Well, I'll whistle for you, sir. And check the line every 15 minutes or so. Something might happen. I checked the lines to the platoons. Everything was quiet, but the quietness was loaded with suspense. It's too goddamned quiet, Captain, Middlebrook said. Lieutenant Ante and Sergeant Webster had left the 3D platoon area to investigate 2 pillboxes several hundred yards to their right rear, with the possibility of using them for the men of the platoon to rest in the daytime. The rapid chatter of an automatic rifle somewhere along the company front broke the stillness. What was that? I asked. Long said, It was from my platoon. I'll check and call you back. I told the platoons to send the men to go to the division rest camp to the CP at 3 o'clock. That would allow time for them to get to battalion before daylight. Long said he had a report on the BR that fired in his area. Someone or something had set off one of the grenade booby traps his men had set to the front of their position, and a soldier had fired toward the noise. But now all was quiet. I looked at my watch. 5 minutes until 2. Maybe it will be 2 o'clock tonight. They haven't used that time before. Yes, tonight it will be 2 o'clock. I prepared myself for the sound of the first shot or the first round of artillery fire that would be designed to soften up our position before they would move in for the kill. The kill! I shuddered. But 2 o'clock came and 2 o'clock went, and all was quiet. I tried to laugh at my fears. Savage and I talked again. I was getting sleepy. Savage was yawning. Somewhere a hand grenade exploded. I held my breath. Everybody's nervous, I thought. 5 minutes until 3. 4 minutes until 3. 3 minutes. 2 minutes. 1 minute. Now. But not a sound. Perhaps my watch was a few minutes fast. Perhaps they had been delayed in the jump-off. Perhaps my nervousness was kindling my imagination. You're frightening yourself for nothing. They took a beating last night. They won't be back tonight. 3:15. God, but I'm sleepy. 3:20. I can't keep my eyes open for another minute. 3:25. Savage, what do you think? I'm so sleepy I can't hold my eyes open. Go on and get some sleep, Captain. You've been up almost all the time we've been in this goddamned place. Colonel Tuttle called this morning and wanted to know when the hell you did any sleeping. Oh, I get as much as anybody else. The Colonel just sleeps when I do. You're going to get yourself sick, Captain. Okay, we'll wake Sparky and Blackburn in a few minutes. I hate to be asleep when anything happens. It scares the hell out of me, and I can't think like I want to. 3:30. Maybe they'll try the half hour tonight. 3:35. Oh, hell, what am I worrying about? If they didn't hit us at 3, they're not coming. I'll get some sleep. I woke Sparky. He and Blackburn changed places with Savage and me and began to heat themselves a cup of coffee. I called the platoons to make sure the men for the division rest area were on the way. They were starting out now. I cautioned Sparky to wake me if the slightest disturbance occurred, but I knew they wouldn't wake me unless it seemed absolutely necessary. I climbed into the bunk. It was warm where Sparky had been lying. I must have fallen asleep before I even pulled the covers over me. All was quiet. It seemed that I had been asleep for hours when I awoke suddenly with a start. Sparky's voice came to me from somewhere in the distance. "I'm trying to get artillery! I'm trying to get artillery!" Blackburn's voice was somewhere there beside it. "Get me Captain Anderson! Get me Captain Anderson!" But what was that noise in the background? What was that pounding? Someone must be beating on the pillbox with a sledgehammer. What was that deafening noise? I jumped from my bunk. My feet stung from the rough contact with the concrete floor. That was artillery and mortars exploding in my head. I couldn't think. I shook my head sharply to clear the sleep from my brain. The Germans had come again. And what mortars and artillery! Good God, they must be firing every weapon for miles around. There was a wild look in Sparky's eyes. "They've hit all 3 platoons, Captain," he cried. "Head on! They're pounding the hell out of 'em! Worst barrage I ever heard! Worst barrage I ever heard, Captain!" The artillery bombardment continued. Through the maze of explosions, I could discern the crushing sound of the big railroad gun which had bombarded us 2 days before. The centre of the shelling passed from the CP pillbox to the pillbox, which housed the 2 mortar squads, and onto the L Company pillboxes, and back again like a pianist running a scale, with a few rounds exploding directly above us, always like accompanying chords. The barrage was deafening. The old fear swelled up again within me and left my body cold and clammy. Would I never learn to stop trembling? Would I never learn to be calm like the others? Or just how calm were the others? I reached for the platoon phone. Thank God it was still in. Middlebrook was on. "For God's sake, get us some artillery, Captain," he cried. "They're knocking the hell out of us. Small arms and burp guns and this goddamned mortar and artillery fire. I never saw such a barrage. We've got to get some help, or we'll never stop them." Blackburn had Captain Anderson on the battalion phone, and I wondered how the line had survived the shelling. I took the phone from his outstretched hand. The men in the pillbox were all awake now. The mortar squad stood ready to move to their weapon the moment the artillery should lift. I told Sergeant Albin to get everybody ready to move outside on the double. We might have to fight from the slit trenches on top of the pillbox if they broke through the rifle platoons. I lived in horror that someone would be trapped inside the pillbox. "This is Mac, Andy," I said into the phone. "They're knocking the hell out of us. Damnedest artillery I ever saw. Give us some artillery all across our front. They've hit all 3 platoons." "Give me the concentration numbers," Captain Anderson said. "There'll be a delay. They're hitting K Company too, and they've got a priority mission on the artillery. I can give it to you as soon as they've—" The phone sputtered and was dead. "Oh, Christ! Get the radio, Blackburn!" Blackburn dived for the entrance. Savage worked with the battalion phone, but it was no use. The line was out. Middlebrook continued to call frantically for supporting fire. I wondered how much longer it would be before the platoon lines would go out. "For God's sake, hurry, Captain," Middlebrook said. His voice was half frantic. "I've got 2 wounded men here in my pillbox now. God knows how many more are out there." "I called for the 1st and 3D platoons." Long said he was catching hell from the barrage, but the main attack seemed to be across the open ground against the other 2 platoons. Sergeant Garcia with the 3D platoon said he had 1 man hit already that he knew of. They were saturating his position with fire. SP fire seemed to be coming from somewhere. Lieutenant Ante and Sergeant Webster had not returned from the check of the pillboxes to the rear. I turned the phone over to Sparky. For the first time, I noticed that Lieutenant Brock and 3 men from the 2D platoon were at the rear of the pillbox, their faces drawn and black from the crude lights they had used in their platoon's pillbox CP. They had arrived to go back to the division rest area. "Quite a send-off we're giving you," I said, and laughed falsely, suddenly afraid for the other men scheduled to go to the rest area. They should have already left their platoons and might have been caught in the enemy barrage. Brock smiled. I hurried out the L-shaped entranceway. Blackburn had set up his radio outside and was huddled in the entrance with the receiver and speaker. It was after midnight, and the call sign for the day had changed. "Hello, Tier 1. Hello, Tier 1, he called. The radio was strangely silent. My heart jumped the remainder of the distance to my throat. Suppose we couldn't reach battalion? "What about the artillery phone?" I asked, half to myself. Blackburn said, "Savage tried it. It's out too. Maybe those son of a bitches at battalion will turn on their radio sometime tonight. Hello, Tier 1? Hello, Tier 1?" There was the sound of a butterfly switch being pressed somewhere on another radio. We waited expectantly. "Hello, Tier 3 to Tier 1. Tier 3 to Tier 1. I hear you and can relay to Tara. I hear you and can relay to Tara. Send your message. Over." It was L Company. For some reason our radio wasn't reaching Battalion, but L Company could hear us and would relay our message. Now that we could reach Battalion, I hardly knew what to call for. K Company had a priority mission on the artillery. The enemy barrage kept us from using our own 60 mm mortars. That left the 81 mm mortars with Company M, but that would mean precious minutes of delay in reaching them through our roundabout communications. But that seemed our only chance, except, I suddenly remembered, the 155S. That close-in concentration we had zeroed to our front. What was it called? Queen 163. Queen 163. Oh God, let us get the 155S. Hello, Tier 1 to Tier 3. Roger. Tell Tier to give us the 155S, concentration Queen 163. And fast. Over. L Company said Roger and repeated my message. I told them that was correct. They said, "Roger, wait." The formality of radio conversations angered me. Why the hell couldn't they get along without so many hellos and Rogers and repeats and outs? My watch was ticking away minutes that might mean life or death to the men in the foxholes and to ourselves. The enemy artillery barrage lifted suddenly. The pounding increased with a new fury upon the forward platoon positions, or perhaps it was that I could hear the shelling they were getting now that our own had ended. Before I had time to realize what was happening, Sergeant Castro's mortar squad had whisked past me, shouted a few fire direction orders, and fed shell after shell into the mortar tube. The blast from the firing almost knocked me from my standing position at the doorway. The sound of Scotty's 2 mortars to our rear coughed an answer. Now we could start giving them something in return. Small arms fire from the front joined in the melee. That would mean the Germans were closing in for the assault. Our 60s couldn't stop them. Please, please, please fire the 155S. Hello, Tier 3 to Tier 1. Over. Hello, Tier 1 to Tier 3. Send your message. Over. I rattled the words off in my impatience. Perhaps this was the news that the heavy artillery was on the way. Hello, Tier 3 to Tier 1. Tier says Roger on Queen. Mac, this is Chief. I have a concentration to your front with my 60s. I'll fire it if you want. Over. It was Captain Eisler, the L Company commander. Hello, Tier 1 to Tier 3. Thanks, Chief. Give us all you can. Over. Savage came to the door. He said, Middlebrook says the mortars are coming in fine. He wants another 200 yards to the right. He turned to me. He says he needs a litter, Captain. He's got one man that's hurt pretty badly, and there may be others. Hello, Tier 1. Hello, Tier 1. Over. Blackburn looked at me in surprise. That was Battalion calling us on the radio. He took the speaker from my hand and answered. Hello, Tier 1. Battalion came back. We hear you now, Check 5. We changed our batteries. Andy says Queen 163 is on the way. My heart seemed to skip a beat. Savage ran back inside to relay the news to the platoons, and the big artillery shells whispered their messages of outgoing death. The deafening explosions to our front were followed by the noise of shrapnel spraying the trees around the farmhouse, and small pieces of spent shrapnel fell around us. I called for a repeat on the barrage, and when Battalion said Roger, I knew we had won. No attacking force could withstand a barrage like that. I checked casualties with the platoon leaders over the platoon phone when all was quiet, marvelling that the light wire had stayed in. Lieutenant Ante had returned to his platoon when I called. He and Webster had started back to their position when the enemy barrage began, but except for being badly shaken up, they were unharmed. He had 2 men wounded. One had been hit in the shoulder, another in the left forearm, but both were walking wounded. The 2D platoon was hardest hit. One man was hit in the left hand, another in the left shoulder, and the man whom they thought initially was badly wounded had only a small piece of shrapnel in his side and could walk back to the aid station with a little assistance. The 1st platoon and the weapons platoon had no casualties, although a light mortar shell had burst within the sandbag enclosure of one of the rear mortars. By some freak stroke of luck, even the mortar was undamaged. It was broad daylight when Lieutenant Brock left with the last of the men for the aid station and the division rest area. The rest area men from the other platoons had not started out when the attack came. The 3rd platoon, carrying detail, came for their rations and returned, and a wire repair crew from battalion came and left again. The German attack was over. The death-like stillness that prevailed on both sides of the valley seemed to mock the foolish little men who had made such hell for themselves a few minutes before. It was another day. The newspapers at home would write of offensive action and say bluntly that extensive patrolling persisted on other sectors of the front. That would mean us. I was awakened when Colonel Tuttle called at noon to discuss the attack. He said that we had evidently repulsed a large-scale assault. K Company had discovered the enemy's approach over the open area to their front a few minutes before 4 o'clock and had gone to work immediately with artillery and mortars. A prisoner taken by K Company said there were tanks in the assault, and I remembered Sergeant Garcia having said that SP fire was hitting his platoon. K Company could count at least 30 enemy dead to their front. Figuring on the usual ratio, that would mean that approximately 200 Germans had participated in the attack. The afternoon was quiet until 5 o'clock, when the big enemy railroad gun opened up again on the area around the farmhouse. It was evidently in the same position as before. The azimuth to the sound of the gun checked, and it took 17 seconds for the huge shell to reach us. We sat stone-faced and rigid in the dubious protection of the pillbox as the enemy fired, round by round, for 30 minutes. Someone from the 3rd platoon called to check the telephone line. "They're giving you rear echelon people hell up there today, aren't they, Captain?" he said. "Yeah," I answered, "but the Blue Star Commandos can take it. Maybe you people don't know there's a war on." Salberg closed one of the iron doors in the entrance to the pillbox. The effect was almost unbelievable. The explosion of the next shell scarcely disturbed us, except for the merry tinkle of the concussion caps in the sides of the pillbox. Night fell and was ominously quiet again. Some soldier who must have been as nervous as I was tossed an occasional hand grenade. It was too goddamned quiet again. I was increasingly sleepy, but even after Sparky awoke at 4 and insisted that I take his place, I did not go to bed. I was determined that I was not going to allow myself to be fogged with sleep if another attack should come, and I was more concerned than ever now with the reduced number of men in the forward platoons. But the ominous stillness of the night was misleading, and the enemy did not come. I went to sleep at 5 o'clock. The enemy began to make up for any peace he had given us during the night with an intense mortar barrage that began at 8 o'clock and continued at intervals through the day. A 20 mm anti-aircraft gun opened up on the forward platoon areas shortly after 10 o'clock, firing from a pillbox. The railroad gun paid us another visit at 3:30 p.m. and stayed for 25 nerve-wracking rounds. We closed the pillbox doors and waited, half expecting to find the farmhouse burned to the ground or knocked from its foundations when we opened the doors again. I wondered just how much longer we would be forced to endure this ungodly position. I felt I would be a nervous wreck if we had to remain here even one more night, but there was no indication that relief was in sight. This was our 9th day in the pillboxes. How much longer? A week? A month? 6 months? If only there was some date we could set to work toward that would give us an incentive for survival. The line to the platoons was knocked out in the shelling by the railroad gun. I told myself that I should not worry about the line going out during daylight hours, but my nerves were more the ruler of my brain than any sense of reason. I insisted that we must have communications, and after the 536 radios failed to function, Sergeant Savage reluctantly volunteered to repair the line. As soon as Savage disappeared from the mouth of the pillbox, I realized the absurdity of allowing him to go out alone on the exposed slope in daylight. The need of the telephone line seemed trivial in comparison to the possibility that he might be wounded or even killed. With my new sense of reasoning, I longed for some way to call him back, but there was nothing I could do except sit and wait. I listened expectantly for the sound of the 20 mm anti-aircraft gun or the crack of a mortar shell, but no sound came. It seemed like hours before he finally returned. The line was in, and I breathed a sigh of relief. He had found the huge crater from one of the shells of the railroad gun astride the phone line. 10 feet of the line were missing. He had curled himself into the crater and used its scant protection while splicing the wire. I began to adjust myself for another night of suspense in the confines of the pillbox as darkness approached. A telephone call came from battalion. It was Colonel Tuttle. I was totally unprepared for the news he had for me. I tried to keep my voice at a normal pitch through the conversation, but I wanted to jump and kick and scream with joy. Tears came to my eyes, and I thought I would choke with happiness. It was almost too wonderful to be true. My battalion runners would arrive around midnight leading the men of Company B. We were getting out of the pillboxes. And tonight, company I was to be relieved. 5 minutes passed after the battalion commander had hung up before I could say a word, and then I merely mumbled ineffectively, "We're getting out, tonight." The way I said it, the speech could not have been in the least impressive, but the faces of the men around me lit up as if I had casually mentioned that the war was over and they were going home. We did not know what was in store for us after we were relieved. It might be even worse or more hazardous than the pillbox positions, but we could anticipate at least one night's rest, and it was difficult to imagine any instance that could be as uncomfortable or as nerve-wracking as our present location. Any change would have to be for the better. We were moving back. The B Company commander, Captain K.K. Cowan of Austin, Texas, telephoned a few minutes later. His time was too short to get forward on reconnaissance, so I gave him what information I could over the phone. My 2 battalion runners would lead his company forward, and I would provide platoon guides to meet him at my command post. The runners would guide my men to the position now occupied by Company B, an assembly area in a patch of woods near the small town of Heckhusheid, 2 miles to the rear. I would leave my heavier weapons and any excess equipment to be picked up by my supply jeep at dawn. I dreaded the passing of the hours until midnight, fearing some catastrophe that might happen in our last few hours in this dreaded spot. But the duties of preparing for the relief kept me busy, and the time passed much more quickly than I had expected. Our relief arrived shortly after midnight. I dispatched the platoon guides with their respective reliefs as quickly as possible in order to clear the nose of the hill of as many men as possible. B Company's headquarters group quickly overran our CP, and I sent my own men, with the exception of Savage, Blackburn and Sergeant Albin, to the company rendezvous point at the fir forest in our rear to relieve the congestion in the pillbox. My 9 days in the cramped quarters had given me an acute case of claustrophobia. Captain Cowan and I sat at the table, and I began to relate our experiences in the position and various details with which he might be concerned. Savage worked similarly with the communications sergeant, and First Sergeant Albin worked with his counterpart from Company B. I became conscious of pains in my stomach, and a wave of nausea came over me. I put my hand to my forehead and realized for the first time that I had a burning fever. I excused myself and walked outside to climb the incline to the latrine. An intense cold had combined with the K-ration diet to give me a violent case of dysentery. I felt better afterwards and came back to conclude the discussions with Captain Cowan. A supply vehicle from Company B arrived. My own men appeared with the heavier weapons to be stacked at the CP to await Sergeant Nifaki's arrival at dawn. Sergeant Albin completed his work and left with Blackburn and the men who had brought the weapons for the meeting place in the rear. Savage volunteered to remain with me, and we planned to wait for our supply vehicle at dawn and return with it. Word came by telephone that my forward platoons were moving out. The last to leave was the 3rd platoon. A few minutes later, a call came for Captain Cowan over the platoon phone. A tenseness came over his face as he answered. He handed the phone back to the soldier sitting at the table. "They just killed one of our own men," he said to me. "One of my squad leaders was moving around to the front and was going back to his hole. One of the BR men let him have it, thought he was a German." I wondered how it would feel to have one of your own men killed by an accident. Having a man killed by the enemy would be bad enough, although I had been mercifully spared even that thus far. I shuddered. "My men are nervous as all hell," Captain Cowan said. "They've heard all sorts of rumours and stories about these positions. Makes them trigger-happy." I decided to try to get a few hours' sleep before dawn. Savage was already snoring in one of the bunks. The night was quiet now, the stillness accentuated by the past activity of the relief. I tried to sleep, but the pains returned again to my stomach, and I got up and went to the latrine. The upset stomach and the burning temperature seemed to make me more nervous than ever. I climbed back into the bunk and tried again to sleep. Savage continued to snore blandly, and I envied him. The battalion telephone rang, and I thought the noise would send me to the ceiling of the pillbox. One of the B Company platoons called. They heard a noise to their front and would like some mortar fire. Captain Cowan calmly called the rear mortar squads. They fired 2 rounds. I wanted to scream at him, asking why in the almighty hell he didn't fire enough to do some good. I tried again to relax, but it was no use. My responsibility was gone now, and I wanted to go with it. I felt I could not bear to stay in this nasty, rotten, stinking, cluttered pillbox one moment longer. The battalion telephone rang, and Captain Cowan repeated its message over the platoon phone. L Company reported a 30-man German patrol behind their lines. They had thrown hand grenades, but the patrol had continued to the rear. The message was clear. Be on the alert. I jumped from my bunk. My God, it was all too clear. They were throwing grenades at my 3D platoon. Just enough time had elapsed for them to have reached the drawer in the rear of the L Company pillboxes. I grabbed the battalion phone and called L Company. Yes, it could have been one of my platoons. They hadn't thought of that. I went back to my bunk more miserable than ever. I wondered why I had ever decided to wait here for the supply jeep. I had no business here now. My men were gone. Technical Sergeant Frederick Weber of Altoona, PR, my weapons platoon sergeant, came into the pillbox with Private First Class Jesse L. Ramsey of Jerusalem, ARC, the platoon radio operator. They had been on the tail of the company after it pulled out from the patch of fir trees, and with 8 other men, including Lieutenant Glasgow, had lost the main column in the darkness. They didn't know the route back. Was there someone here who could guide them back? I heard the sound of a B Company man outside opening the large wooden boxes which contained K-ration cartons. My tortured nerves magnified the sound until it seemed that someone was demolishing a frame building. The Germans would surely toss in a heavy barrage at that sound. I jumped from my bunk. I was getting out. I would guide them back. "Wake up, Savage! Wake up! We're getting the hell out of this miserable place! Wake up, goddammit! We're leaving! Wake up!" The 4 of us made our way across the crest of the ridge, past the bodies of the American dead which my men had stacked there, and I imagined I saw the blonde hair blowing again in the wind. A misty rain had begun to fall, and a chilling wind was picking up strength. In the blackness, I could make out the vague outline of the bodies stacked against the power pole, a harvest for the devil. I found it difficult to realize where I was when I awoke the next morning on the floor of the house in Grof-Kampkenberg that served as the 3D Battalion CP. My stomach felt much better, and my fever had almost disappeared, but the events of the night before and the days before that were vague in my memory. I felt like I had slept off a drunk. The battalion commander and his staff were eating a breakfast of hot cakes and syrup and steaming hot coffee that seemed too wonderful to be true. My clouded brain began to clear, and I remembered how we had become lost in the black space between the pillboxes and Grof-Kampkenberg during the night, and had followed the telephone wire into battalion. I had not known the route to our new assembly area. Scotty had slept in the hay barn outside with the men, and I had bedded down for the night on the floor of the CP. The clean-shaven faces and well-pressed uniforms of the battalion staff officers made me conscious of my own bedraggled condition. I had neither washed nor shaved for days, and my face and hands were black with smoke from the cardboard fires in the pillbox. The United States Army would have hesitated to claim my grimy uniform as items of issue. After breakfast, a driver arrived to transport us by truck to the assembly area near Heckhusheide, and Colonel Tuttle told me that we would relieve Company C in their defensive position after dark. The position was much more tenable than the one we had left, he added. As I was leaving, Colonel Tuttle received a telephone call from Captain Joe Stevenson of Shreveport, LA, the K Company commander, and I waited to hear the message. 2 German medics had come up to his forward platoons and had been brought back to his command post. They wanted to arrange a 4-hour truce along the battalion front to allow the removal of the dead from the attack against I and K companies, and wished to return to their lines to give the American decision. Colonel Tuttle agreed to a 2-hour truce, but stipulated that the medics must call the information across the lines. They would then be taken prisoner and repatriated later through the Geneva Red Cross to be assigned to another sector of the front. The drive to Heckhusheide necessitated a roundabout trip through the woods to the rear, even though the town was only slightly over a mile to the northeast from Grof-Kampkenberg. The highway between the 2 towns was under enemy observation. Heckhusheide was situated along a high ridge. 3 unimproved streets, clustered on either side with sturdy stone houses complete with manure piles, eventually curved and connected with the paved highway from Grof-Kampkenberg that ran along the south edge of the town and onto the east to the C Company positions which we would occupy. The highway made a junction there with a north-south highway that ran generally parallel to the Siegfried Line and entered the German town of Utfeld in the valley in front of the pillbox positions we had left. My company was in an assembly area in the woods, a few hundred yards to the south of Heckhusheide. My command post was in a 5-room rose-coloured house beside the highway. Parts of the town were under enemy observation. A number of men had gone for showers when we arrived. There had been no transportation available, but they had walked the 2 miles to the regimental CP town of Heckhallenfeld, eager at the prospect of getting a bath. The men who had been to the division rest area would return in the afternoon. The company had had a hot breakfast brought up by our own kitchen, and there would be a hot meal for lunch. A single shell from an enemy 88mm high-velocity gun had screamed into the area around 8 o'clock, exploding on the highway near the CP and injuring one of the buck sergeants from the 3D platoon. Lieutenant Ante had been suffering from a concussion since the night of the last German attack in the pillbox positions. He was having dizzy spells and his head ached constantly. At my insistence, he reported to the aid station and was evacuated. Technical Sergeant Garcia, the platoon sergeant, took over the platoon. Our kitchen jeep was leaving to obtain rations at service company and would pass by the regimental shower point, so I took advantage of the ride. Savage went with me. The firing batteries of the 37th Field Artillery Battalion overlooked the town of Heckhallenfeld, the noise of the big guns almost deafening us. An engineer unit had set up a water purification system and shower point beside a small, swiftly running stream that curved its way along the north edge of the deep valley in which the town was located. We went inside a large squad tent beside the stream and selected approximate sizes from neat piles of clean clothes. The shower room in a half-demolished barn across the stream was crowded with laughing, joking GIs in various stages of nudity. Clouds of steam rose from the end of the barn containing the showers, half hiding the muscular, naked bodies of the soldiers. A large metal oil can had been fitted with pipe to serve as a glowing red stove. We undressed and waited our turn in the line for the showers. The water was exhilarating, although it was so hot at times that I thought it would surely take off my skin, and then so cold that my teeth chattered. It had never occurred to me that I could derive so much pleasure from a bath. It was my first, other than from a helmet, for 2.5 months. After lunch, I left with Captain Howard C. Alfson of Grand Forks, North Dakota, the C Company commander, and my platoon leaders to reconnoitre the new positions. We walked in the shallow ditch along the highway toward the east, running as we reached a road junction at the eastern edge of town, since, as Captain Alfson explained, we were under observation and the Kraut shell the hell out of it all the time. 2 partially destroyed houses and a burned hulk of a jeep at the road junction attested to the fact. We passed 2 other houses on the left of the road. The ground on our right was open, but rose slightly now to screen our movements from the right front. The area to our left was a series of rolling hills with deep wooded draws. We came to a third house approximately a half-mile from Heckhusheid, and Captain Alfson explained that it was used as a CP by his 3D platoon. Sergeant Garcia stayed to reconnoitre his platoon area, and we continued to a spot where two houses a few yards apart formed an L-shaped courtyard in their rear. A thin hedge of fir trees formed the other two sides of the courtyard. The house on the left was occupied by the 2D platoon, whose positions were on a knoll 200 yards to the northeast. The house on the right faced broadside to the enemy and housed the company CP with the 1st platoon CP in the barn section on the right. The ground in front dropped off sharply, and the north-south highway ran a few yards in front of the building. From an upstairs window, Captain Alfson pointed out the light machine guns on a knoll with the 2D platoon. A half-mile to the right front were pillboxes within the Siegfried line occupied by the 2D battalion. Almost 2 miles to the left lay the town of Winterspelt, atop a hill held by cannon company of our regiment, acting as a rifle company. Both the wide gaps between our position and the friendly elements were completely undefended. 600 yards to the front, I saw the dragon's teeth of the Siegfried line, backed up by a series of enemy-held hills and a high ridge topped by 3 gutted buildings on the horizon. We gained entrance to the company CP by climbing a ladder to a second-floor rear window. I decided that the architect must have been a German sympathizer and had constructed the doors on the side of the house facing the enemy. The room on the second floor was a shambles of broken furniture, but the lower floor was neatly arranged. The windows were sandbagged to protect against shrapnel. Company C had suffered no casualties since taking over the position. There had been a few mortar barrages when the men became too brazen in moving about the buildings, but generally the area had been quiet. The exposed highway to the rear prevented the transportation of supplies by day, but they had set up one burner from their kitchen in the barn of the house occupied by the 2D platoon, and there cooked 10-in-1 rations for the company. We returned to our wooded assembly area in time for a hot supper, and began the relief immediately after dark, exchanging positions 1 platoon at a time. I found myself much calmer than when we first occupied the pillbox positions. The last units of C Company left shortly after 1 o'clock, and I settled down to sleep. I had insisted that either Sparky or I should be awake at all times, but I consented to Sparky taking the larger part of the night watch until I could catch up on my sleep. The succeeding days were like utopia compared to the grueling days and nights in the pillboxes. The men improved their foxholes by putting log and plank covers on them and enlarging them so that one man could sleep while another pulled guard. We set out anti-tank mines on the highway, as well as booby traps and barbed wire in front of the foxholes. Contact patrols ran nightly to Cannon Company, but experienced no difficulties. All men from the rifle platoons occupied their foxholes at night, but we kept only a skeleton force on position during the day, allowing the men to return to the warmth of the houses to rest. A cold, beating rain set in the first morning, but the men complained little since they were able to dry their clothes during the day. We slept on an assortment of mattresses, pillows, and hay. The venturesome 2D platoon killed a heifer on the second day, claiming she had stepped on a mine, and I was invited for a delicious steak. Another group left for the division rest area. The enemy harassed us little, except for the ominous knowledge of his presence. We received a few rounds of 20 mm fire the first morning, October 14th, but it was high and caused no damage. 3 fanatical Germans crawled through the underbrush to within a few feet of the foxholes of a forward outpost of the 2D platoon around 10 o'clock the first morning. 1 was killed, and the men thought they had wounded the other 2. The papers from the dead German were brought to my CP, and I forwarded them to battalion. The Germans always seemed obligingly to carry unit identification papers with them on patrol. Artillery continued to shell the road junction to our rear and the town of Heckhusheid, but only 1 barrage fell near our positions. On the night of October 15th, Lieutenant Fudekar's anti-tank platoon from the farmhouse in the pillbox positions arrived to exchange positions with another platoon in our area. They brought us the news that the Germans had finally scored a direct hit on the farmhouse with the big railroad gun, setting fire to the barn section of the house, but the men had prevented the fire from spreading. In general, however, the area had become much less active since our departure. On Monday afternoon, October 16th, Colonel Tuttle telephoned that I was to leave one rifle platoon, plus my light machine gun section and one mortar squad, to defend the area around the houses, pulling the remainder of my company back into the assembly area on the edge of Heckhusheide. This would enable us to feed hot meals to all except the platoon outpost and give the battalion a larger reserve force in the event of an enemy penetration of the undefended sectors. We disliked the proposal, as we were becoming acclimated to our new positions, but as often happens with army orders, we obeyed them. We left slightly before dawn the next day, leaving the 2D platoon, the light machine gun section, and Sergeant Castro's mortar squad in the readjusted positions. I planned to relieve them every 2 days. Our CP group moved again into the rose-coloured house beside the highway, and the platoons moved into the woods. The men constructed squad bunkers, dug several feet into the ground, and built of logs from fir trees. They were not elaborate, but they proved more comfortable than individual foxholes and slit trenches. Enemy shelling of Heckhusheide increased. My CP was under observation, and the enemy seemed determined to blast it away. As we lay flat upon the floor during the barrages, it often seemed they would succeed. There were numerous near misses, and the outside walls were sprayed with shrapnel. It was here that I was introduced to the German Nebelwerfer, a multi-barreled affair fired electrically, whose terrifying moaning shells earned it the GI nickname of Screaming Mimes. Just after dark on October 19th, Staff Sergeant Threadgill, the mess sergeant, and Corporal Woodrow W. Lloyd of Jacksonville, Texas, the transportation corporal, were returning to service company after bringing up the supper meal by jeep. An incoming artillery barrage caught them between the CP and Heckhusheide. A shell landed a few feet behind the jeep, wounding Lloyd slightly in the shoulder and severing an important nerve in Threadgill's right arm. Both men were evacuated. Staff Sergeant William F. Elliott of Mount Pleasant, Texas, took over as mess sergeant, but Lloyd's position was held open in anticipation of his early return. Sparky was evacuated temporarily with a light case of intestinal flu. We received 25 replacements, some of them former members of the company who had been wounded and were returning to duty, among them Staff Sergeant John T. Weingardner of Altoona Par, who became platoon sergeant of the 3D platoon. Private First Class Abraham Rojetnik of Bronx, New York, a replacement who spoke German fluently, joined company headquarters as an interpreter. Men came and went to the division rest area, bringing back tales of warm brick barracks, tiled showers, Red Cross girls, and Boku wine and cognac. Sometimes they brought back the wine and cognac. The 3D platoon relieved the 2D on the outpost, and the following night the Germans set up a loudspeaker near the position and treated the riflemen to a round of jive music and a plea to surrender, claiming that communist, Jew-loving Roosevelt had involved them in a hopeless war. The platoon was hardly impressed and called for a heavy artillery barrage on the location of the sound. The weather was abominable. It either rained or the skies were heavily overcast and the ground became soggy with mud. The dirt roads became almost impassable. Day by day the weather grew colder, and the daylight hours grew shorter. Cigarettes became difficult to obtain. Each man was ordinarily issued 1 package per day, but we considered ourselves lucky to get 3 packages for an entire week. The Stars and Stripes told us of a growing cigarette famine at home due to shipments to soldiers overseas, and we wondered if they were being dumped into the ocean. Everyone got showers at regiment and clean clothes of a sort. Socks were issued along with the food occasionally. We received 2 issues of month-old magazines from Special Service and 2 issues of Armed Services editions of popular books. My mother wrote that she had thought of sending me a home recording of the family's voices for Christmas, but had reconsidered. I wrote her that she showed amazing foresight. There was not a radio or phonograph available anywhere. Church services were held on Sunday in a barn near battalion headquarters. I was preparing to attend when I was called to a meeting of company commanders at battalion. There, Colonel Tuttle told us that permission had been granted by higher headquarters for the regiment to withdraw from the defences now held within the Siegfried Line to a new line on higher ground running north-south, generally along the line now held by my platoon outpost. We were to construct log dugouts on the reverse slopes of the ridges and dig in for the winter. The pillboxes we had formerly occupied would be blown up, and the troops would withdraw to defences to be prepared prior to D-Day, November 1st. I went with Captain Anderson in the afternoon on a reconnaissance of the sector which company I would occupy. We would defend the hill now held by my platoon outpost and occupy the reverse slope of the ridge running north along the highway toward Cannon Company's positions. Company L would tie in with us at the houses occupied by the outpost and extend west along the Heck-Huskide highway and into town. My company would be defending almost 3/4 of a mile, with a gap of over a mile on the left flank. This sector alone would ordinarily have been defended by a regiment, and I was told that the same situation existed along the entire division front of 27 miles. We began work on the new positions the next day with the assistance of a platoon of engineers from the 2D Engineer Battalion. My first platoon would defend the area around the houses at the old C Company positions. A deep draw and a gap of 600 yards would separate them from the 2D platoon positions, which were half hidden on the reverse slope of a steep hill to the left of the draw, by a forest of trees that had already shed their leaves for winter. A clump of trees and bushes beside the highway and between the two platoons would house a daylight outpost. My company CP would be near the bottom of the reverse slope behind the 2D platoon, 10 yards above a deep draw that followed the rear contour of the forward platoon positions. Another hill, covered with fir trees, rose to the rear of the draw, and would be occupied by the 3D platoon in support. The company kitchen would be partially dug in on the reverse slope of the hill occupied by the 3D platoon, and a 60 mm mortar squad would be placed with each rifle platoon. The deep draw behind the forward platoons joined 5 other draws at a densely wooded point 300 yards to the left rear of the positions. Here, a squad of men from Company K would maintain an outpost position covering the junction of the draws. The remainder of the distance to the Cannon Company defences in Winterspelt would be undefended. During the initial days of construction, we continued to occupy the assembly area near Heck-Huskide, going to and from work each day like a labour gang. The engineers usually met us at the area, and one day found 2 Germans near the embryonic positions waiting to surrender with a white flag. A reconnaissance patrol came in on the 1st platoon at the outpost position on October 25th during the early morning hours of darkness, but none of my men was wounded. The next morning at 4 o'clock, Sergeant Meade, one of the squad leaders, was standing guard in his foxhole on the knoll to the left front of the houses when he saw the glint of a bayonet in the darkness a few feet in front of him. He fired his submachine gun quickly, killing the intruder and setting off a maze of rifle and machine gun fire from the other defenders that repulsed the German attack without suffering a single casualty. 2 other Germans were killed. The men estimated there were 40 Germans in the surprise bayonet assault. The German attack did not frighten me because it was over before I received the news, but I could not avoid joining the other men in thinking that the enemy was following Company 1 around. We had endured a veritable hell in the pillbox positions, only to find that the area quieted considerably after our departure, and now we had moved into a supposedly quiet sector, only to have the enemy hit us with a savage bayonet assault. The veterans with the company were even more of this opinion than I. They had seen the company cut to ribbons by a German counterattack on Hill 192 near Saint-Lô, France, and blown to bits by the German pillbox explosions on the outskirts of Brest. Evidently, I had inherited quite an outfit. On the day of the bayonet assault, I left for the division rest area in company with Sergeant Savage and our quota of other enlisted men. All my officers had already been there, and Sparky had returned from the medical clearing station where he was treated for influenza. We made the 30-mile trip to Vielsalm by truck convoy. The town was sprawled among a series of high surrounding hills and seemed undamaged outwardly from the war. The rest camp had been established in a former Belgian army barracks, neat brick buildings facing on a concrete quadrangle. The camp was complete with an indoor weapons range, a Red Cross club, presided over by 3 attractive American girls in trim blue uniforms, a mess hall, with tables and dishes, an auditorium gymnasium, where USO shows were held, a movie theatre showers, with tiled individual compartments and steaming hot water beyond the fondest dream of any infantryman. The streets were named after American cities. The gymnasium was Madison Square Garden, and the movie theatre had been christened the Paramount. First Lieutenant John R. Glenn of Waycross GA was the director of the camp. He met our convoy and gave us a brief orientation. The men were assigned to bunks and told when they could use the showers, but there were few rules and regulations. The only roll call formation would be held at 10 o'clock in the morning, 2 days later. That would be our day of departure. I made my way to the showers after lunch. I had turned off the water in my compartment when I heard my name mentioned in the dressing room. I stopped instinctively to listen. It was Private First Class Robert J. Beach of Fairview Village, Ohio, whose nickname of Brooklyn belied his Midwestern nativity, but not his definite Brooklyn accent. He was talking with an acquaintance from another company. "And it looks like we've finally got the company commander we've been looking for. He came in about a month ago, a replacement. What's he like?" "He's damn young," Brooklyn went on, "but he doesn't seem scared to come around and see you once in a while, no matter where the hell you are. He seems to care what happens to you." My hand was raised to open the door of the compartment, but I halted abruptly. It would embarrass Brooklyn for me to step out into the dressing room now. I turned on the water again to wait until the 2 men had gone. Perhaps here was the answer to the querulous thoughts that had plagued me persistently since I had first joined the company. Would I be accepted despite my youth and inexperience? If this was the answer, it was even more than I could have hoped for. If only Brooklyn's words mirrored the thoughts of the entire company. I tried to believe that they did. I attended a movie with Savage that night and a USO show featuring Joe Twerp and Herb Schreiner. We went down to the village the next morning and bought wine and souvenirs. A group of GIs told us about a shop near the edge of town which sold ice cream. We found it and a bakery nearby, and after standing in an olive-drab line, had apple pie à la mode. We were like kids, excited with the slightest luxury. We met 2 Belgian girls in a cafe and walked home with them. Our motives might have been ulterior, but one, whose name was Lucy, asked in simple innocence why it was that all the American soldiers wanted to sleep with the Belgian girls. That thwarted any ideas Savage and I might have entertained. Lucy gave me a printed pamphlet with a Catholic prayer which I was able to translate with a little difficulty. She insisted that I wear it next to my heart. When I returned to the company at Heckhusheid, I found that little had happened during my absence except for continued enemy shelling. A self-propelled gun had blasted away at the house on the outpost position that had formerly housed my CP and had almost demolished the forward wall, but no one was injured. The 2D platoon received my permission to move into their new positions in the afternoon, and I followed 2 days later with the entire company. We began to cover our front with a maze of double-apron barbed wire entanglements. The regimental anti-tank platoon laid anti-personnel mines for us by night. Initially, each rifle squad, the machine gun section, each mortar squad, and each section of an attached machine gun platoon from Company M constructed 1 log dugout each from fir trees. 6 bunks, arranged in tiers of 3 and made by stretching potato sacks over timber frames, were the principal furnishings, but the men supplemented these with tables, table covers, mirrors and stoves from the houses in the 1st platoon area and Heckhusheid. Doors and sometimes windows were brought from Heckhusheid. The town was denuded. As the days passed, more bunkers were constructed, providing 2 per rifle squad, 2 for each machine gun section, and 1 for each platoon CP. The fighting foxholes were elaborately constructed with covers and floors. Men ate from mess kits in a chow line, usually reserved for rear areas, except for the 1st platoon who carried their chow to the platoon area in large Marmite cans, since they were at such a distance from the kitchen, My company CP was larger than the squad huts. Its furnishings included a large table and a sofa which the men transported from Heckerscheid to serve as my bunk. The back of the sofa was detachable and doubled for another bunk at night. Our stove was an abortive German masterpiece that was always either too hot or too cold and filled the room with smoke. The company headquarters messengers constructed a supplementary bunker near the CP. Battalion headquarters was slightly over a mile to our rear. Our supply route rambled over and around a series of high hills in an effort to avoid enemy observation, and the engineers constructed a long corduroy bridge over the junction of the draws on our left. Despite the bridge, however, vehicles were continually getting stuck in the soft mud of the valley. We established an elaborate intra-company communication system with 19 sound-powered telephones and 6 German phones, which enabled any squad or outpost to communicate directly with me in the event of trouble. Life became routine in the relative comfort and quiet of our new location. The weather was rough, freezing rain, sleet and snow combinations, but we sat in our log dugouts and read in the stars and stripes of offensive operations of other American soldiers on more active sections of the front and were grateful. Only the 1st platoon positions suffered from enemy action. They were shelled at least once daily, and the right squad in positions on the forward slope around the houses was unable to move about in daylight except behind the houses. The mortar squad with the platoon was kept busy oftentimes at night throwing shells at suspected patrol movements to their front, but there were no more assaults upon the position. 2 rounds of artillery fire from our own 105 mm guns fell short in the 1st platoon area one night, but caused no damage. The next morning, a single round of 155 mm artillery fire crashed into the trees above the 2D platoon positions, wounding one man slightly on the forehead. Supporting Corps artillery finally admitted that one of their gunners had made an error in adjustment. The big guns echoed up and down the deep draws at night, sounding as if they were fired from just outside the CP door. Enemy robot bombs began to buzz over our positions at frequent intervals, but they were merely curious sights to see. We were amazed at the stories of fear of the bombs in the rear areas. Sending out patrols became a mental hazard for me. Our nightly contact patrols to Cannon Company were not particularly dangerous, but I shuddered each time the battalion intelligence officer called for me to send out a patrol into the enemy lines. I would spend long, weary hours awaiting their return, all the while cursing higher intelligence officers who seemed to have nothing more to do than send out patrols. I knew that a certain amount of patrolling was essential to determine enemy activity to our front, but oftentimes men were sent out with ridiculous missions to get information we already knew from daylight observations and had reported. I knew that some of the patrols accomplished little more than providing a neat typewritten report to go to the next higher headquarters. I considered my company extremely fortunate to have no one killed in the dangerous patrolling, particularly after 3 men from Cannon Company were killed in an ambush in front of our position.